Arthur Sterling, a man worth $11.3 billion, was staring at a water-stained ceiling from a mattress that smelled of old rain and neglect. It wasn't a reality show. It wasn't a bet or a sudden bankruptcy. He was hunting for a rare currency that $40 million contracts could never buy. A single decision by a complete stranger was about to rewrite the future of an entire building and expose the raw truth of human kindness. One act of mercy was all it took to change everything. Arthur Sterling lived in a world of 12-foot ceilings and expensive silences. His penthouse was a masterpiece of glass and steel, a 10,000-square-foot fortress that overlooked the New York skyline like a king surveying a kingdom he no longer loved. Every morning began with the same ritual: a $5,000 pair of Berluti leather shoes clicking across cold, pristine marble floors. A $10,000 watch strapped to a wrist that felt heavy with the weight of things he couldn't spend. At 42, Arthur was the architect of an empire worth $11.3 billion. He signed $40 million contracts with the same casual indifference most people used to sign a grocery receipt. But behind the custom-tailored suits and the predatory gaze of a CEO, there was a hollowness that no amount of acquisition could fill. He was a man drowning in a sea of shallow connections. His father, the late Montgomery Sterling, had been a man of granite and ice. He had raised Arthur with a single brutal philosophy: trust is a luxury for those who can't afford to be betrayed. The poor don't want your help, Arthur. They want your place. They are thieves of opportunity. For 3 decades, Arthur had believed him. He viewed everyone through the lens of leverage. Every charity gala was a tax write-off. Every handshake was a background check. He lived in a world where loyalty was bought and sincerity was a marketing tactic. But lately, the silence in his penthouse had started to scream. He looked at his reflection in the floor-to-ceiling windows and saw a stranger, a man who had everything but belonged nowhere. He realized that in 20 years of business, no one had ever looked at him and seen a person. They saw a bank account. They saw a ladder. They saw a way out of their own problems. He wondered if anyone in this city was capable of kindness when there was nothing to be gained from it. That was when the plan formed. A social experiment born of desperation and a dying hope that his father had been wrong. He decided to shed his skin. He spent a week in a cheap motel, letting his beard grow into a scratchy, unkempt mess. He stopped the manicures and the expensive haircuts. He traded his Italian wool coat for a faded, oversized work jacket he'd bought at a thrift store in Queens for $12. It smelled of industrial laundry soap and old wood smoke. He found a pair of scuffed boots and jeans that were frayed at the heels. He wasn't Arthur Sterling anymore. He was Artie. Artie was the kind of man property managers avoided. He looked like a liability. He carried his life in a single battered duffel bag. He practiced a certain slouch, a way of walking that suggested the world had already beaten him and he was just waiting for the final blow. He wanted to be the troublesome tenant, the man with no references, no steady paycheck, and a history of bad luck that sounded like a series of excuses. He had identified several rent-stabilized buildings in neighborhoods his board of directors would call high-risk zones. These were the places where every dollar mattered, where a tenant who couldn't pay was a direct threat to the landlord's own survival. He would go to these places and offer them a nightmare. He would be the tenant who might lose his job tomorrow, who might break the plumbing, who might need a miracle just to make it through the month. He wanted to find the breaking point of human empathy. As he stood in front of a full-length mirror in the dingy motel room, he barely recognized himself. The sharp lines of his face were softened by the stubble. The arrogance in his eyes was replaced by a practiced, weary desperation. He looked at his hands, ragged fingernails, skin chapped from the biting New York wind. He felt a strange, terrifying sense of freedom. For the first time in his life, he wasn't the man with $11.3 billion. He was a man with nothing. And as he stepped out into the freezing January air, heading toward the first address on his list, he whispered to the ghost of his father, "Let's see who's right, Dad. Let's see if there's anyone left who sees the man before the money." The click of his leather shoes was gone. Now, there was only the heavy, hollow thud of work boots on the cracked sidewalk. Nothing. Silence. The test had begun. The Hope apartment stood on a corner where the wind seemed to bite harder than anywhere else in the city. It was a name that felt like a cruel joke, written in flickering neon letters where the H and the P had long since burnt out. The brick was the color of dried blood. stained by decades of exhaust and the heavy, humid indifference of New York. Arthur stood at the entrance, his $12 thrift store duffel bag weighing more heavily on his shoulder than his leather briefcase ever had. He stepped inside. The air in the lobby was a thick cocktail of lemon bleach, old cooking grease, and the faint, persistent scent of damp carpet. The linoleum under his boots was cracked, revealing layers of older, uglier flooring beneath a history of neglect told in plastic and glue. He walked toward the management office, his boots thudding hollowly on the floor. Sarah was sitting behind a desk that had seen better decades. She was younger than he expected, perhaps in her early 30s, but life had written a much longer story on her face. There was a bone-deep exhaustion carved into the corners of her mouth and the dark hollows beneath her eyes. Her hair was pulled back into a tight, practical bun, and her lips were chapped from the biting January air. Behind her, a small, humming refrigerator was covered in magnets. They weren't souvenirs from Mediterranean cruises or Swiss ski resorts. They were yellowing slips of paper. A $412 electricity bill with a red past due stamp. A $1,200 medical notice for a pediatric clinic. A handwritten grocery list that had been crossed out and rewritten to be cheaper. "The room is $850 a month," she said. Her voice was steady, but it carried the tremor of someone who hadn't slept through the night in weeks. Arthur leaned against the doorframe, deliberately injecting a sharp, jagged edge into his voice. "I've only got $600, he barked. He watched her eyes. "And I don't have a deposit. I'll have the rest when my check clears, if it clears." He waited for the rejection. He waited for her to point to the door and tell him to get lost, to tell him that she had a business to run and a daughter to feed. That is what Montgomery Sterling would have done. His father would have called security before the sentence was even finished. Trust is a currency fools spend freely. Sarah didn't move. She looked at his ragged jacket, his unkempt beard, and the practiced, weary anger in his eyes. She didn't see a billionaire. She saw a man who was one no away from the sidewalk. "I need the full amount for the insurance, Artie," she whispered. She looked down at the bills on her fridge, her hand trembling slightly as she adjusted a magnet. "Well, I don't have it," Arthur snapped, crossing his arms. "So what's it going to be? You want the room to sit empty, or you want the 600? Silence filled the cramped office. The only sound was the radiator clanking like a dying machine. Sarah sighed a long, heavy sound that seemed to drain the last of the light from the room. 500, she said quietly. Arthur blinked. "What?" "Give me 500 now," she said, looking back up at him with eyes that were tired but impossibly clear. "Keep the other 100 for food. You look like you haven't had a hot meal in a week. Pay me the rest when you can." Arthur felt a strange, cold sensation in his chest. This wasn't in the script. He was supposed to be the troublesome tenant, yet she was offering him a lifeline she clearly couldn't afford to give. An hour later, Arthur stood in the cramped bathroom of Unit 4B. The space was tiny, the tiles stained a dull yellow, and the air smelled of metallic rust. He reached down and gripped the handle of the sink faucet. With a deliberate, forceful twist, he snapped the internal valve. Water began to spray instantly, a cold, violent jet that hit the mirror and soaked the floor. He didn't try to stop it. He didn't reach for the shutoff valve. Instead, he walked to the door and yelled into the hallway, his voice echoing with fake entitlement. "Hey, landlord, this sink is garbage. This whole place is a dump." Sarah appeared minutes later. She was carrying a heavy metal wrench and a damp towel over her shoulder. She wasn't angry. She didn't scream about the damage or the cost of the repair. She just looked resigned. She knelt on the wet linoleum, her jeans soaking up the cold, dirty water. She didn't even look up at him. "I'm sorry," she said quietly, her hands working the wrench against the rusted pipes. Her fingernails were clean but ragged, the skin around them red from the cold. "The plumbing is old. I should have checked the seals before I let you in here." She was apologizing to him. The man who had deliberately broken her property. The man who had been nothing but a burden since he stepped through the door. Arthur watched her work. He saw the way she winced when the wrench slipped, her knuckles hitting the porcelain. He saw the weight of the world on her shoulders. Yet she was still trying to fix a mess she hadn't made. "Why don't you just kick me out?" Arthur asked. His voice had lost its edge, becoming lower, more honest. "I'm late on the money. I'm breaking your stuff. Why bother?" Sarah stopped. She didn't look up, but her shoulders slumped. Because I know what it's like to have the world waiting for you to fail, she whispered. And I won't be the one to push you. Nothing. Silence. The only sound was the steady drip of the leaking faucet. Arthur looked at his own hands, the hands that had signed $40 million contracts without a second thought. For the first time in 37 years, he felt the weight of something money could never buy. Armor. It was finally starting to crack. The sound of the rain against the hospital window was a hollow, rhythmic drumming, but it was drowned out by something much worse. The steady, clinical beep, beep, beep of a heart monitor. Indy lay in the bed, her small frame swallowed by white sheets, her skin the color of parched bone. Sarah sat in the plastic chair beside her, her hands locked together so tightly her knuckles were white. She looked like a woman who had been carved out of shadows and exhaustion. A nurse had just handed her a slip of paper. 2184美元72美分. The cost of the emergency procedure and the first night of stabilization. For the CEO of Sterling Global, that was a rounding error on a lunch bill. For Sarah, it was an impossible mountain. It was the distance between her daughter breathing in silence. Arthur stood in the doorway, watching. He felt the coldness of his father's voice echoing in his skull. Desperation makes thieves of everyone. He needed to know. He needed to find the breaking point where the kind landlord finally became a predator. He returned to the Hope Apartments before Sarah. He went to the basement. The air was thick with the smell of damp earth and rotting wood. He found the main electrical panel, a rusted relic of the 1970s. With a deliberate, calculated movement, Arthur took a heavy metal bar and jammed it into the main fuse housing. A sharp crack, a flash of blue ozone. The smell of burning copper filled the room. Instantly, the building went dark. The humming of the refrigerators, the dim hallway lights, the faint sound of televisions, all of it vanished into a suffocating blackness. Arthur climbed the stairs as the tenants began to spill into the hallway, shouting, complaining, panicking. He saw Sarah walking toward her office, her face illuminated only by the pale light of her phone. She looked broken. The building's insurance didn't cover negligent maintenance on an outdated system. This was a $3,500 repair. She now owed over $5,000 she didn't have. Her daughter was in a hospital bed, and her livelihood was literally in the dark. Arthur intercepted her in the narrow, shadowed hallway. "Power's out," he said, his voice flat, demanding. "My food's going to rot in the fridge. You going to pay for that?" Sarah didn't even look up. She was leaning against the wall, her eyes closed. "I'll fix it, Artie. I promise. I need a moment." Her voice was a whisper, a thread of silk ready to snap. "Moments don't fix wires," Arthur snapped. As he turned to walk away, he reached into the pocket of his thrift store jacket and pulled out a leather wallet. It was an old battered thing he'd found, but he had stuffed it with $3,000 in crisp $100 bills. He let it slip. The wallet hit the floor with a soft, heavy thud. It landed right at Sarah's feet. In the dim glow of her phone, the corner of the leather flipped open, revealing the thick stack of green ink and promises. Arthur didn't stop. He didn't look back. He kept walking down the hall, his heart hammering against his ribs in a way that $40 million mergers never caused. He waited around the corner, hidden in the shadows of the stairwell. Would she pick it up? Would she tell herself it was found money? Would she justify it because of Indy? Because of the electrical bill? Because the world had been so cruel to her that she finally felt she was owed a win? His father's voice was a roar now. "Watch her, Arthur. Watch her become exactly what I told you they are." Minute 1, silence. Minute 2, the sound of a heavy breath. Minute 3, nothing. Wait. He heard the sound of slow, heavy footsteps. They weren't moving toward the exit. They were moving toward his room. A soft knock. Arthur opened the door. Sarah stood there. In her hand, she held the wallet. She wasn't smiling. She wasn't relieved. She looked like she was carrying a lead weight. "You drop this, Artie," she said. Her voice was trembling, not with greed, but with a terrifying kind of integrity. Arthur stared at the cash. "There's $3,000 in there, Sarah. That's more than you need for everything." Sarah looked at the money, then back at Arthur. "It's not mine," she whispered. "No one would know," Arthur pushed. "The lights, your kid, you could fix it all right now." Sarah pulled the wallet back as if the money were burning her skin. She shoved it into Arthur's chest. "I'd know," she said. "And if I lose my soul, I have nothing left to give my daughter." She turned and walked back into the darkness of the hallway. Arthur stood in the doorway of his freezing, dark apartment, holding $3,000 that felt like worthless paper. Trust. It wasn't a currency. It was a sacrifice. And Sarah had just paid the highest price possible to keep it. Sarah didn't look at the $3,000 like a savior. She looked at it like a test she refused to fail. Arthur watched her through the cracked door of his darkened room. The money, the exact amount that could pay for Indy's surgery and restore the power to her building, lay in her palm, illuminated by the cold gray light of the hallway. "It's yours, Artie," she said. Arthur didn't reach for it. He wanted to push her one last time. He wanted to find the greed his father promised lived in every desperate soul. "Sarah, look at this place," Arthur said, his voice a low, jagged gravel. "You're drowning. That money, it's a life raft. Just take it. Tell the police you found it on the street. No one will ever know." Sarah didn't flinch. She stepped forward and pressed the worn leather wallet into his chest. Her skin was ice cold, but her eyes held a fire Arthur hadn't seen in the boardrooms of Manhattan. "I'd know," she whispered. "And I have to look at myself in the mirror when the lights come back on. I have to look at my daughter. If I teach Indy that theft is how we survive, I've already lost her." She turned to leave, but stopped when she heard Arthur's stomach growl, a sound he had practiced until it sounded like true, hollow hunger. He looked smaller then, huddled in his thrift store jacket on the edge of a stained mattress. He looked like a man who had forgotten the taste of a real meal. Sarah hesitated. She looked at the bills on her fridge, then back at the man who had been nothing but a burden since he arrived. "Wait," she said. 20 minutes later, Sarah returned. She wasn't carrying a debt or a worry. She was carrying a bowl. It was a chipped ceramic dish, steam rising from it in the freezing air. It was simple chicken broth with a few wilted vegetables, but to Arthur, it smelled more complex than any 5-course meal at a Michelin-starred restaurant. "Eat," she commanded gently. Arthur took the bowl. The warmth seeped into his fingers, thawing the numbness that had settled into his bones. He sat in the silence of Unit 4B while she stood by the window, watching the rain wash the grime off the New York streets. "Why are you doing this?" Arthur asked between spoonfuls. "I've been a nightmare tenant, Sarah. I broke your plumbing. I complained about the power. I'm a stranger who can't even pay his full rent. Why feed me?" Sarah didn't turn around. Her silhouette was a thin, sharp line against the city lights. "Because being hungry doesn't make you a bad person, Artie. It just makes you a person. My father used to say that the world will try to take everything you have, your home, your health, your hope. But it can't take your character unless you hand it over." She finally looked at him, and Arthur saw the bone-deep exhaustion again. But beneath it was a peace he had never felt in his $11.3 billion life. He realized then that he had spent his entire life protected by glass and steel, yet he was the one who was truly fragile. This woman, with nothing but a chipped bowl and a sick daughter, was the strongest person he had ever met. "Money is just paper and ink," Sarah said quietly. "It comes and it goes. We can lose everything we own in a single afternoon." She paused, letting the silence of the dark building settle between them like a heavy, cold blanket. "But if we lose our kindness," she said, her voice cracking just enough to let the pain through, "then we have nothing left to leave for our children. And I refuse to leave Indy a world that is poorer than I am." Arthur stopped eating. The soup was warm, but his chest felt like it was on fire. He looked at the woman who had nothing, giving him the only thing she had left, her dignity. He thought of his father, Montgomery Sterling, and the cold, marble lessons of his childhood. Trust is a currency fools spend freely. Arthur looked at the empty bowl in his hands. His father was wrong. Trust wasn't a currency to be spent. It was the only thing that actually had value. Everything else was just numbers on a screen. For the first time in 37 years, Arthur Sterling didn't feel like a man drowning in shallow water. He felt like a man who had finally found the shore. "Thank you," he said. Sarah just nodded, took the empty bowl and walked back into the shadows of the hallway. Arthur sat in the dark for a long time. He reached into the hidden pocket of his jacket and felt the cold, hard plastic of his black credit card. Tomorrow, the world would change for Sarah. But tonight, it had already changed for him. Nothing. Truth. Kindness comes first. The morning came with a sound the neighborhood had never heard. It wasn't the screech of an ambulance or the heavy roar of a garbage truck. It was the low, predatory hum of 12-cylinder engines. 4 obsidian black SUVs turned the corner of the block, their tires gliding over the cracked asphalt like they were afraid to touch the poverty. Sarah was standing on the sidewalk, her breath blooming in the frozen air. She was waiting for a plumber she couldn't afford to pay. Beside her stood a few neighbors, the ones who had laughed at Artie and his battered duffel bag. They watched, silent, as the lead vehicle stopped directly in front of the flickering hope sign. A man in a dark suit stepped out and opened the rear door. Arthur Sterling emerged. The stubble was gone. The $12 thrift store jacket had been replaced by a custom-made vicuña coat worth more than the entire building's annual revenue. His shoes, those $5,000 Berlutis, clicked against the sidewalk with a sound of absolute authority. Sarah blinked, her hand flying to her mouth. "Artie?" she whispered. The name sounded small, out of place in the presence of the man standing before her. Arthur didn't smile. He looked at the building, then back at Sarah. He saw the same bone-deep exhaustion in her eyes, but today, there was no darkness in the hallway behind her. He had seen to that hours ago. "My name is Arthur Sterling," he said. His voice wasn't the jagged gravel of a drifter anymore. It was the calm, resonant tone of a man who owned the skyline. "And for the last 6 months, I've been looking for something that doesn't exist on a balance sheet." He stepped closer, ignoring the gasps from the neighbors who had once mocked him. "I have traveled to 10 cities," Arthur continued. "I have rented 50 different rooms in 50 different buildings. I played the part of the troublesome tenant, the man who breaks things, the man who misses rent, the man who has nothing to offer but his own failure." He looked at Sarah's ragged fingernails, the ones he had watched work a wrench in a flooded bathroom. "In 49 of those houses, I was evicted. I was screamed at. I was treated like a virus that needed to be eradicated. People saw my poverty and decided I had no value. They saw my struggle and decided I wasn't worth the breath it took to say no." Arthur paused. The silence on the street was absolute. "You were the only one, Sarah. The only one who saw a person instead of a problem. You gave me soup when you were hungry. You gave me time when you were drowning in debt. You protected my dignity when yours was being stripped away by a world that doesn't care about single mothers in brick buildings." Arthur reached into his coat and pulled out a leather folder. It was simple, elegant, and carried the weight of 1,000 miracles. "Indy's surgery is already paid for. I've secured the best pediatric surgeons in the country. They're waiting for her at the Sterling Medical Center." Sarah began to cry, not a loud sob, but the silent, racking release of a woman who had finally been allowed to let go of the weight. "This folder contains a lifetime scholarship for Indy," Arthur said. "From kindergarten to a doctorate, if she chooses. She will never have to worry about the cost of a dream." He turned toward the building, then back to the crowd. "As for the Hope Apartments, the mortgage has been settled. The electrical grid was replaced at 4 a.m. And Sarah, the deed to this building is now in your name. You are no longer the manager. You are the owner." The neighbors who had keen rare Artie now looked at the ground, their faces flushed with the sudden realization of what they had ignored. Arthur looked at Sarah, who was staring at the folder like it was a holy relic. "My father told me that the poor were dangerous," Arthur said quietly, his voice catching for a split second. "He told me that if I gave an inch, they would take everything. He was wrong. You gave me an inch, and you gave me back my soul." Arthur Sterling, a man worth $11.3 billion, realized that for the first time in his life, he wasn't just signing a contract. He was witnessing a resurrection. "Trust isn't a currency for fools, Sarah," he whispered, loud enough only for her to hear. "It's the only thing that makes us human." He turned and walked back to the car. The click of his shoes echoed on the pavement, not with the coldness of marble, but with the weight of a promise kept. Nothing. Justice. The king had visited, but the queen was staying. Arthur Sterling returned to his penthouse that night, but the silence no longer felt like a heavy, expensive vacuum. He stood before his 12-foot-high windows, looking out over a New York skyline that finally had a pulse. For 20 years, he had surveyed this city like a fortress to be conquered, a grid of assets and liabilities. Now, it was a tapestry of stories, each light in each window representing a soul that might be one no away from the sidewalk. He didn't just write a check for Sarah and walk away. Arthur knew that $11.3 billion was a hollow legacy if it only sat in a vault. Within 3 months, the Hope Apartments had been completely transformed. The brick, once the color of dried blood, was restored to its original warmth. The radiator no longer clanked like a dying machine. It hummed with a quiet, efficient warmth provided by the new solar grid Arthur had installed. But the most significant change wasn't the building's infrastructure. It was the heart of it. Sarah Reeves was no longer a manager drowning in a sea of past due notices. She was the executive director of the Sterling Reeves Foundation. The building had become a sanctuary for single parents, a place where the rent was adjusted based on what people could actually afford, and where the first floor was converted into a state-of-the-art pediatric clinic and childcare center. Sarah still cooked her chicken broth, but now she did it in a kitchen that smelled of fresh herbs instead of damp carpet. Indy, now recovered and vibrant, walked to school in a coat that actually fit her, her laughter echoing through hallways that were no longer dark. Arthur spent more time at the Hope Apartments than he did in his boardroom. He realized that the $40 million contracts he used to sign were nothing compared to the human ROI he witnessed every day. He watched a father get his first job after 6 months of unemployment. He watched a mother finally sleep through the night because her child's medicine was no longer a choice between health and groceries. In his own company, the culture shifted. He stopped firing people for bad luck and started investing in their resilience. He realized that his father, Montgomery Sterling, had been a very rich man, but he had died an absolute pauper. Montgomery had died believing that everyone was a thief of opportunity, never realizing that he was the one who had been robbed of connection, of empathy, and of the simple, bone-deep joy of being trusted. Arthur looked at his Italian wool coat, hanging in the closet next to that faded $12 thrift store jacket. He kept both. The expensive coat reminded him of who he was, but the old jacket reminded him of who he had found. He realized that the value of a man isn't calculated by the numbers on a screen or the height of his windows. It is measured by the weight of the burdens he chooses to help others carry. It is measured by the way he looks at a person who has absolutely nothing to offer him in return and decides that they are worth everything. The world is a cold place, and it often demands that we harden ourselves to survive. It tells us that trust is a weakness and that kindness is a luxury we can't afford. But Arthur had learned the truth. Kindness isn't a luxury, it's the foundation. Nothing matters more than the character we leave behind. Trust is the only currency that doesn't lose its value when the market crashes. In a world where you can be anything, Arthur whispered to the reflection of the city, choose to be kind. If this story reminded you that there is still light in the dark corners of the world, and if you believe that a single act of kindness can rewrite a person's future, please consider subscribing. Together, we can continue to tell the stories that matter and remind each other that humanity is a currency we should all spend freely. Thank you for being part of this journey.